Hello, and welcome to Realign Journey, the unfiltered guide to self-discovery and reconnection. I'm Sierra Sambrowski, your host, and together we'll deep dive the topics that have caused us to lose touch with ourselves and explore ways to reconnect to our true self. This week, I am joined by Lee Paha. For those that don't know Laura Lee, she is a dedicated generational healing facilitator in Nashville, Tennessee. She focuses on empowering mothers with small children to break free from the cycles of family trauma. Her mission is to help women prioritize themselves so that they can create a life filled with joy, peace, and amazing relationships with their children while ending the patterns of intergenerational wounds without guilt, conflict, or blame. Hi, Laura Lee. Thanks for being here today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I know I'm excited to have you back. For anybody that listened before, you were my number one episode on my very first season, and now you're my number one episode on my second season
So
too.
exciting, such an honor.
I love having you. So today we decided, Laura Lee and I, that we would like to discuss emotional triggers and how to identify them and how to create some new habits around responding to them. And I think the first thing I want to ask you, because I know this is definitely something that you work a lot with clients. How do we even begin to identify that something we do, some reaction we have or behavior we do is actually an emotional trigger response?
Well, I think there's um, two things that are usually giveaways that it's an emotional trigger. The first I would say is something that seems to be like a reoccurring pattern. Um, like the same things keep popping up that cause you to have this really strong reaction over and over again. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and then the second would be like when you have these moments where you feel very triggered, if you're able to look back in hindsight, it's probably going to seem like, well, that didn't really seem like that big of a deal. I don't know why I reacted so strongly to something that was a little bit smaller than the reaction.
Yeah, that's a really good one. Because I was thinking about this morning before we got on, and I was like, how did I start to realize that I was having emotional triggers personally? Because
Hmm.
I'm like, I don't know. I mean, part of it was self-awareness, but you're right. I think for me personally, that probably was what it was that like started to catch my attention as I was doing my own healing work and being more aware of myself and my behaviors. I started going, oh man, I totally lost my shit over that. And that was not something worth losing my shit about. So, I
Yeah,
mean,
like small cause, big reaction is usually the telltale sign of something within you being triggered.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what do you think? I mean, is there sort of core things or more common things that are often emotional triggers, or do they look entirely different for everyone?
Um, I think that they probably look different for everyone, but I would say if there is a common theme, it's probably like something that happens in our romantic relationships more often than not. I think that might be the
Mm,
common theme is like our partners have the tendency to, I don't want to say they are triggering us, but we're triggered by these interactions with our partners most commonly. But again, like
mm,
anything can be a trigger, and I think it varies from person to person. But I would say that's probably something most people have in common.
yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I
Hmm.
certainly have always said, like, for all the healing work we do, it's like going to medical school, but until you get into your clinicals and have to start putting in the hours in ER, and that you don't know what you don't know. Like, you think you have all this knowledge, even if you're taking passing the test well. And I always say,
Mm-hmm.
like, our romantic relationships to me are like that clinical trial in the ER. Like, that's
Oh
when we
yeah.
find out how much we've really cleared and how far we've really come.
Yeah.
For sure.
And I don't know about you, but typically, like when I have an argument with my partner and like situations where one or both of us get really triggered, like we can look back on it, once things have cooled down or maybe like a month later and be like, why did we fight about that? Like that was so stupid. So again, it's
Yeah.
like, yes, it bring those relationships bring it up, but usually it's like the cause versus the reaction that you get are so unequal.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Like you said, or I would just even like sometimes even just like an hour later, I'm like, I'm really sorry. I
Mhm.
clearly was feeling some sort of way about something that remind. In fact, we had an episode. It wasn't, I wasn't actually emotionally triggered. I didn't have the reaction, but I was thinking about um he wasn't finished eating. Jason wasn't finished eating last night before I was. And so I was sitting there and he was like, you don't have to wait. And I was like, I can't leave you at the table alone to finish eating. Like, that would be terrible. And he was like, why? And I could feel all this like interest in, like, because I was really observant about it. And I was like, I could feel all this kind of like shame come up in me around just thinking about leaving the table and leaving him. And he was like, why? Why is that a deal? And I said, oh, I don't have an exact memory, but I think that there must have been situations when I was growing up where somebody had to sit at the table until they finished their plate, like no matter how long it was. And there's this really like lonely, shameful, like
Mhm.
ostracized kind of feeling. So I don't ever want to do that to somebody, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so even though I didn't have it like an outward response, there was this internal emotional trigger for me that was happening because I was getting these emotions. So I mean, do you see that kind of thing also with clients? Like maybe they are not outwardly reacting, but they're telling you about some kind of internal response they're having to situations. Is that common?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think that um you kind of brought forth like the most important feeling or emotion when it comes to triggers, like how we might react in the moment. And this is different from like that internal feeling you were describing, but we might react to triggers with a lot of anger or rage, but I think shame is always that underlying feeling. So yes, some people will react to triggers with this outward expression. But yeah, I think, I talk to clients who are internalizing it and feeling it, even if they're not showing it on the outside.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think shame is the underlying emotion? Do you have any idea about that?
Mm. Well, I think that triggers are always connected to something that happened to us in childhood that's taking us back to something in childhood that's still unresolved and we're carrying it with us. And that feeling of shame is just so strong. It's one of the lowest vibrations of emotions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and when we have something like that that's unresolved, like it makes sense to me that like shame, since it's the lowest vibration, would take the longest to be able to see it and resolve it.
Mm-hmm. How would can you describe this is gonna sound weird, but
Hmm.
I know even through my own healing journey that if somebody had been like, well, does that make you feel shame? I'd have been like, I don't know. Like, is there a way that you could describe to people? Because I personally believe, and you're welcome to chime in on your belief around this too. I think that getting to the root of what's happening, like not just saying, okay, I got angry. Like, that's fine if
Hmm.
you've been so disassociative that you couldn't even identify that you were angry. But at some point, we got to get to a deeper level of what's causing that anger.
Hmm.
Anger is a response. So that's kind of why I'm pressing about like, can you, some
Shame.
possible way. Yeah. Explain like what shame is, what it might feel like for somebody if they don't know.
Yeah, I think that um I know there's a difference between embarrassment and shame, but it's like this strong sense of embarrassment, like you don't want to be seen. Um, you might like want to crawl out of your skin or go run and hide. And I think what it all boils down to, and I think this is why it's so connected to being emotionally triggered, is because it's this message that we've been carrying with us that something is inherently wrong with us.
Mm,
And that's
yeah.
that thing, that's that shameful feeling, is like something is so wrong with me that I just want to hide and I don't want anybody to see this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. It's all that deep self-judgment. And
Mhm.
I think for some people it goes even further. It becomes like self-loathing and self-hate, which
Yeah.
is incredibly detrimental to our
Well, if you
lives.
think something's inherently wrong with you, it's going to be really hard to cultivate that sense of self-love.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How do you see that? You like to really focus on people that have children, women that have children. How do you see these emotional triggers? We talked about romantic relationships, but how do you hear from clients that are they seeing them show up with their children also? Like, is that
Like
pretty
in
common?
the way that they interact and
Mm-hmm.
respond to, yeah, I mean, I think probably the most common thing is just being a mom, and moms are dealing with a lot and there's a lot of stress, and the moment that that button is pushed, maybe they snap on their kids.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not really, maybe the kids were aggravating them doing something to push the buttons, but the response that you get is so much, again, so much bigger than the cause. So
Yeah.
yeah, like there's absolutely that um triggering dynamic between parents and children. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of it just the way that I so if I'm going to help my clients begin to navigate this, the first step we're going to take is to kind of help them connect like what they're feeling in that present moment. And this can be whether it's we're talking about the parent-child dynamic or romantic relationships, but you look at like the thing that happened in the moment and then helping them trace it back to an earlier memory, kind of as you described doing with like
Mm-hmm.
leaving the dinner table early. And just bringing some awareness to that helps. Because the reason I believe that we're reacting so strongly to these smaller causes when we get triggered is because our nervous system is so dysregulated because it's
Mm.
taking us back to that earlier time. So it really doesn't matter who you're interacting with. We talked about at the beginning, different people are triggered by different things. You could be triggered by your partner, you could be triggered by your kids, you could be, I think this is probably the most relatable, by a stranger driving past you on the interstate, right? Like we get triggered a lot in our cars, but the reason that we're reacting so strongly is because our nervous systems are dysregulated because it's taken us back to this earlier memory. It's not what's happening in the present moment, it's what happened a long time ago, and our bodies are still carrying that
Mm-hmm.
memory and the
Mm-hmm.
feeling.
It's interesting that you bring up about being in the car because as self-aware and as much as I've overcome so many things as I've worked on my own healing and development, I have very rarely and very minimally reduced my reaction in the car.
It's hard.
I and I am forever questioning, why does being in the car give me this license to yell at people and get mad in a way that I would never do in my personal life? What do you have any idea what that's about? Because I have been trying to figure that out and I cannot. Is it just because we're self-contained and it's like safe almost to blow off that way in some ways?
I think so because when I think, at least for me, it's like when I have those moments where I feel triggered with my partner, there's that moment where it's like, I could react to this right now, and I know that things are going to get blown way out of
Oh
proportion, and
yeah.
then we're going to be dealing with this for hours,
Mm-hmm. Or
right? But you
days.
can,
Yeah.
or days, but you can unleash all of that anger and rage when you're alone in the car yelling at somebody who's never going to be engaging with you, and you don't have to resolve it, and you don't have to go through all of that. So yeah,
Yeah.
maybe it's just a chance to like get it off of your chest. But I think it's
Yeah.
also a good time, like a good opportunity to do some self-reflection and be like, why does that bother me so much in the first place? But yeah, most of us I think are just looking to be able to blow off that steam. So we just do it.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So, I mean, so starting with some sort of level of self-awareness, obviously, is
Mm-hmm.
a good way to start managing that. And then if you can work your way back through tracing to a memory,
Mm-hmm.
um, that may be the root. How do you, I mean, obviously, having an awareness and being able to connect it back to a memory is a great start. But you and
Mm-hmm.
I both work with people with unprocessed emotions. And so that's not necessarily helping them process. How do
Right.
you, so that you can reduce the emotional trigger or maybe
Mm-hmm.
even eliminate it altogether, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you like to help sort of, what are some of the different ways that you work with people, that you encourage them to work with themselves to start processing these old memories? And, I mean, this is the trauma response, and there's a whole conversation about what's trauma and what's not. And I had this conversation with somebody the other day. I believe that trauma is any kind of experience that shifted the way you see the world and yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah, I
that can
totally
be
agree.
very big or very small for different people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, how do you kind of think is ideal for people, and how do you work with people, recommend to people that they start processing through these things to reprogram, is the word I would use,
Yeah.
that experience?
Yeah. So, there's so many reasons why I start with helping people make those connections and doing the memory tracings. But a big reason is so that when we feel triggered in the present moment, it creates this, you have the awareness, and that allows you to create this moment in time where you can pause instead of just reacting. Because before we've done the healing work and started to create that awareness, more than likely those emotions are going to start firing off immediately. And whether we're outwardly projecting them and reacting towards someone else, or we're internalizing it, feeling it all inside, they take over pretty quickly. So when
Mm-hmm.
you trace the memory, it allows you to stop and pause and think about like where it came from. And the first step is just being able to create that space where you can sit with your emotions and begin to identify them. So that's where I have people start. But if you've never done the work before, it's really difficult to do that in the moment when you're feeling triggered, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because that's how we've been wired, that's how we've been conditioned, is to just like react and the emotions start to build. So what I start with is encouraging my clients to spend just a little time every morning or some part of the day where they know they can carve out quiet time, and starting really small, just sitting by yourself, no phone, no distractions, for just 5 minutes. So you get more comfortable with just sitting with yourself and whatever emotions are coming up in that moment. And it's really like building a muscle. Um, and so we start with 5 minutes, and I encourage them to build that over time so it becomes a habit. And the more time you're able to spend just sitting in that quiet, the easier it's going to be to spend just a little time, even if it's like 30 seconds when you feel triggered. So you're not immediately going into reaction mode, but you can have a chance to breathe and kind of regulate that nervous system so you can actually process those feelings instead of letting the feelings take over. So it's really about building this foundation of nervous system regulation.
And the best way to really start doing that is to spend time with ourselves each day and kind
Mm-hmm.
of build that up. Okay. Because I mean, that was kind of part of what I was thinking was, what about these people? I mean, I was the opposite of this. I internalized everything. And you just mentioned like that's doesn't mean that the reaction isn't just as severe and overwhelming. But it's certainly very different than somebody that acts out and it has these impulsive emotional outward reactions to
Mm-hmm.
things, right? And so that's kind of what I was thinking is I don't know. You work with clients that in this way. Is it more common that people that outwardly react have less it's harder for them to be able to trace back their memories and break the habit of outwardly reacting so impulsively?
I don't think so.
Okay. I don't
No.
know.
Usually it takes a little bit of digging because sometimes we've repressed those memories, but if you start asking the questions and just taking them back to that where that feeling originated, it doesn't matter if they're reactors or internalizers. I haven't seen a difference in how quickly
Okay.
people can get there.
Same thing with spending the time. You see that to be equally effective for people that are outward reactors as opposed to an inward reactor.
I think that it's more difficult for reactors to be able to sit with what they're feeling because internalizers have been doing that.
Yeah.
They're sitting with it. The difference is that I'm trying to get them to a place where everyone, whether they're reactors or internalizers, are sitting in a seat of observing instead of a place of judgment.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but because, I think reaction's a way to like just push it away from you and get it out there and get it over with. It's harder for them to sit with what's coming up because it's so uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's what I was kind of, I mean, I think that's kind of where I was like going in my own way was it seems to me that that would be the case.
Hmm.
That it would be a little harder to start kind of remanaging yourself and coming up with new habits and new ways of processing because that seems so much more like reactive and impulsive to me. But I think you made a really good point about, yeah, the internalizer is already sitting with themselves.
Hmm.
Like you're already doing that. But I also really love that what you said is what you're really trying to do is to get people to stop judging themselves in the moment.
Yes. So then the key, like whether to get away from that place of judgment or um, to help people who have those strong reactions, because for them, it's going to be super uncomfortable to sit with what they're
Mm-hmm.
feeling. For the internalizers, you're trying to break that habit of judgment and be able to get them to just observe. So the next thing you have to do is to provide them with tools and resources to get to that place. And it's all about calming the nervous system enough so you can either step back and stop that cycle of going through the thoughts and feelings in your head and placing judgment and blame, um, or for the reactor, getting them to a place where it's not so uncomfortable to have to sit with everything they're feeling when they're used to just like unleashing it. Um, so yeah, it's just like providing with the resources at that point. What can you do to help ease that discomfort?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I have like a whole toolkit because different things work for different people, but
Right.
for some people, I'd recommend grounding,
Mm-hmm.
learning to use your breath and doing breath work practices to help calm the nervous system. Um, cold water exposure. These are all things that can help regulate our nervous system. But again, just like getting used to being able to just sit with what you're feeling for short periods of time, just like that's building a muscle. The nervous system regulation practices are it's like building a muscle too.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're literally like, that's what you're doing. You're learning to essentially rewire your nervous system and how it processes stress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Plus, it also seems to me, and I don't know this to be a fact, but it also seems to me that part of what's happening besides your nervous system having this really wonky response is that you typically are going into this really cyclical, obsessive thought pattern also,
Mm-hmm.
which obviously feeds the nervous system reaction, but it is kind of two different things. One's a physiological response
Mm-hmm.
and one is a mental response, right? So certainly I can see that like splashing some cold water on my face might get me to stop thinking for a few seconds. It might interrupt that pattern also,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yes. And so I think that the nervous system regulation practices are have more instant gratification, even though it does take time to build the muscle. But yeah, anything that can kind of snap you out of that train of thinking. But after I've gotten somebody in the habit of taking time to sit and practicing these healthy, um, regulation tools, the next thing I typically recommend is meditation. And that one's kind of a harder muscle to build for most people because I don't think that people tend to see the benefits as quickly as they do with those other practices. But that is like one of the most powerful tools to be able to stop breaking those mental cycles because it's literally teaching you to step back and be the observer of your thoughts and emotions
Mm-hmm.
instead of that active participant.
And the idea of letting them go, like
Mm-hmm.
detach from them so that even when they show up, you're not judging them in any
Mm-hmm.
kind of way and they can just move on through.
Yeah. I mean, that's the difference between letting them pass and then going into that cyclical response that you mentioned.
Yeah. Because I feel like as we're talking this all through, that it's the self-judgment piece that seems to keep representing itself. Like the self-judgment is really the cause of the shame, which is really the
Mm-hmm.
cause of the reaction, right? So it's really that self judgment that is fueling all of these things.
Yeah. And it's not just the internalizers who deal with that too.
Right. Yeah,
Like
no.
I live, my partner is a reactor and man, she feels like that self-judgment so strong after she
Mhm.
reacts to something when she feels triggered. And it does. I think that's like one of the biggest pieces that keeps us stuck and in those cycles
Yeah.
is the shame and the self-judgment that we feel, whether we're sitting there with it, internalizing it, or we're, reacting.
Yeah. Which breaking the cycle of self-judgment is a lot bigger than
Hmm.
just interrupting yourself from being so emotionally triggered and having these outward um responses or an internalizing response that is really unhealthy and unhelpful for all of your relationships, including the one with
Hmm.
yourself, right? Do you feel like emotional triggers ever totally go away? Like, is there a way to heal and process through them enough that they don't even elicit any kind of response hardly out of you anymore?
I don't know, because personally, like I still struggle with them too.
Hmm.
They just don't have the same hold over me like they used to. And I think that's, healing's a journey, and that's, exactly what we're talking about. I don't think we ever get to a place where they completely go away.
Hmm.
It's just about doing enough healing work and making it a regular practice so that it's easier to identify why we feel that way. We have the tools to work through it from a mental place, from the physical place with the nervous system. And then I guess like the other piece that I feel is really important when it comes to triggers is really nurturing your relationship with your inner child.
Mm,
Because when we're, like we've talked about, we're going back to a previous time, probably something that happened in childhood. And I think that it is that inner child that's trying to get our attention
mm,
when we feel that emotional trigger, because there's something that happened to her or something that she felt or something she didn't receive that she's still wanting you to see and to
mm,
reconcile in a way. So I think the stronger bond and relationship you can build with your inner child, where you be the one who goes to her when she feels triggered and you can offer her that reassurance. And it might seem silly, but like really having a conversation, be like, look, like I've learned how to sit with this. I've learned how to take care of myself, because that's really what we're doing. We can call it like nervous system regulation and meditation, but really it's just a way to take care of ourselves, self-care. And I think reminding your inner child that you've taken all these steps to take care of yourself, to take care of her, that's like one of the key pieces to
mm-hmm.
really getting, you're never going to get past the emotional triggers, but to feeling like you're the one who's empowered and in control and that you can navigate it, and letting your inner child know that, hey, we've got this.
Mm-hmm. I'm just kind of processing what you were saying because I didn't really think about the fact that that extreme emotional trigger is your inner child acting out for what they need, acting out to call attention to something that is unhealed. So I'm kind of
Yeah.
processing that, but it makes a lot of sense. I mean, it makes a lot of sense about where does that wounding, we talked about, started with talking about where does that wounding come from and how you have to
Mhm.
trace that back. And it's okay, yeah, but you also, it's not just tracing that memory. It's also being able to, like you just said, be able to kind of satisfy and help reframe the experience that your inner child had at that
Mhm.
time when it originally happened.
Yeah.
That feels big. That feels big. And I wasn't thinking about it like that. Interesting. Okay. Interesting. All right. I would say that really has me like so in my head right now that I can't even think about what else I was gonna think about.
Well, I'm happy to share an example, and it kind of goes along with your question
Yeah.
of like, do these triggers ever go away?
Yeah.
So, like a big one for me is anytime that I'm having to stand up and speak in front of a group of people. And I know it comes from my childhood wounds around rejection and abandonment. And, now that I have these tools and resources, like I know that feeling when it comes up, like we're going around the room and it's about to be my turn to stand up, and oh my gosh, it's like my head starts spinning. It feels like my heart has dropped to the bottom of my stomach and it is just pounding.
Mm-hmm.
And I use those tools, especially the inner child work, where I will step back and just imagine that little Laura Lee is sitting right next to me and she is terrified because she doesn't know what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
She doesn't know how she's going to be received. She's afraid that everybody's going to reject her and think that what she has to say is so stupid and so
Mm-hmm.
pointless. And so
Mm-hmm.
I just sit there and I'll have a conversation with her and I'll be like, "Look, we know this person and this person, and they really like us. And we've talked to all of these people before, you know what you're going to say. You feel really confident about it, except when you're put on the spot. And look, I'm here with you. Like, you're not doing this alone. I have experience doing this. I've worked really hard to build confidence for me and for you. We've got this.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah,
Yeah.
I would like be so embarrassed if everyone in the room knew I was having this inner child dialogue, but it has totally made the difference between before I started doing that and I would just stand up and like word vomit, whatever it was that I was going to say
Mm-hmm.
that I had memorized, to really being able to center myself and calm myself down so that I can stand up and feel grounded and speak from a place that's like really rooted and feels truly confident. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's a total game changer, and for me it's all been about having that conversation with my inner child, because I know that is the part of me that is so afraid and so triggered.
Mm-hmm.
Because like as an adult, I have no reason to be afraid of talking to people. I know all the people for the most part. I've done that speech a bazillion times.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's
Mm-hmm.
no rational reason for it. So yes, I
Mm-hmm.
knew like it's this other part of me that's having this strong reaction. So kind of talking her through it is for me like the biggest game changer.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really great tool. And it's so funny that you use that as an example because literally as you were just talking, it took me back to a memory of why I have not been able to identify. Um, of why, because when I was a kid, I used to sing on stage, I would act, I used to sing solos, like I had no fear about that. And as I got older and older, I started to develop that anxiety. I mean, I pushed myself through it, but um I started same thing, like my stomach doesn't drop, mine stays like goes up into my throat and I feel
Mhm.
like I'm hyperventilating, like I can't breathe. And I know it's irrational. Like I will talk to myself and I'll be like, this is an irrational response. Take some deep breaths. I didn't really think about connecting it back to my inner child though. I don't know why. I don't know why I didn't,
Well, you'll
that
have to try
particular
it next
thing.
time.
Yeah, I
Talk
will.
to
I mean,
little Sierra.
I've gotten better anyway. Like you said, like the more and more you put yourself out there, there's a certain amount of like, okay, this is safe. Nobody's gonna like attack me or start yelling at me or telling me I'm stupid or any of that stuff, right? So I've gotten better about it, but every once in a while it happens still. And I'm always like, why does this still happen to me? Because I feel confident, like you were saying. So, I mean, I think that is a really excellent example. And it's a great way to showcase how, even if you kind of move yourself through and heal certain aspects of it, it can still show up. And until you can really get back to the root of it, and work
Hmm.
with that child response and reframing that child's response, probably it's going to keep at least show up sometimes with
Yeah.
as much force. I mean, that's the thing too. I think that um you're right. I imagine that some of these things will always still ping us a little, but we're not having this involuntary response to it, or the response, as you were saying at the
Hmm.
beginning, is not so much bigger than the event. Like now it's just like a little ping, like, I
It
remember when that used to bug me.
Yeah, it definitely gets less intense the more and more you use those tools.
hmm Is working with your partner, and I know this probably would not work with every partner and in every dynamic, but one of the things that I was thinking too is that because it's so common for it to come up with our partners, these sort
Hmm.
of emotional triggers, is there any kind of practice, any suggestions you could recommend where your partner, who has to be able to not also have an emotional response to your emotional trigger response,
Hmm.
um but is there a way that your partner can some, because if you are so out of touch with being able to reparent yourself,
Mm-hmm.
finding somebody else safe, it can be, I would think, a good stepping stone to kind of help you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it does require a certain degree of consciousness from both people because our
Mm-hmm.
tendency is going to be react, 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 going back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have that consciousness and awareness, and at least one person has
Mm-hmm.
gotten to the place where they can pause long enough to not react to somebody who has just been triggered, um, and just kind of ask or have the awareness of what they might need in that moment. Sometimes you might have to ask.
Mm-hmm.
Um, sometimes when you've been with somebody long enough, you know what they need.
Mm-hmm.
And like maybe your natural tendency is to just try to talk about it right away, or you're reacting back. But if you can give them that space and step away, or you're able to ask them like, what do you need in this moment?
Mm-hmm.
And they tell you like, I need for you to just hold me and nurture me, or I need space, I need for you to step away so I can diffuse. I think those are really good first steps. And I think even before you get to that point, just being willing to sit down and talk about it after the fact, when you've gotten to that place where everybody's calmed down, whether it's hours or, like you said, maybe a couple days later.
Yeah.
But if you're both willing to go back and talk about it, I think that for us, like in my relationship, has been the biggest thing, just being really vulnerable and saying, like, I know this is how I reacted, but then I felt like this. And it's like I felt really ashamed, and just having this deeper understanding of how your partner's operating. That's the thing that kind of can help you understand what they might need in that moment, or how you can respond that will kind of diffuse the situation or give them a
Mm-hmm.
little bit of comfort, or and also knowing how to take care of yourself in those moments.
Mm.
It's a lot.
Yeah, yeah, because I mean, yeah, you're right. It's about having that awareness that, oh, my partner's having an emotional trigger, is being emotionally triggered right now. But,
Hmm.
you know, that doesn't mean they get to be such a raging lunatic that it's verbally abusive or emotionally,
Yeah, yeah.
that's not, excuse me, that's none of that. Not that at all. And like you said, there's such this reactive quality. I know for myself, um, my partner also is an outward reactive emotional triggered person. And that is in a nutshell my biggest emotional trigger is to have
Hmm.
somebody outwardly emotionally reacting at me. Nothing makes me want to like pull up, retreat, run away, shut down, all the things, because that's how I often respond. Um, and so yeah, there's this whole other dynamic of needing to be able to hold space for yourself in those
Hmm.
moments. And there's times where I can witness it and I go, okay, I know this is coming up for him. I know where this is coming from. I get it. And then if it keeps going and going and going, and then finally I'm like, oh, I've had enough of this shit. Like, that's it. I'm, I cannot hold space for you anymore. And now I'm done. Now I'm triggered, right? Is there any, I don't even know, because it seems like it would be such an individual thing, but are there any suggestions that you might have to be able to give to someone when it is their partner, or maybe it's even a coworker or anybody, right? That you can clearly be aware that they're being emotionally triggered. How do you hold space and kind of boundaries and protection for yourself during that so that you don't now get triggered?
Hmm.
Is there anything?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say that the first thing is just kind of checking in with yourself to make sure that you're not getting triggered. And if you feel like you are, then obviously the first thing you're going to want to do is to take care of yourself first and just trying to calm yourself down. But if you feel like you can come from a place that's really centered and grounded, the best thing you can do is just to have a conversation with that person when they're not in that heightened, triggered state, and be like, oh, also, like, it has to be somebody that you're comfortable enough with to have this conversation. But like asking them when you're feeling triggered, like, what can I do, or what do you need from me that would help you?
Mm, yeah.
And even if you think that they don't have the awareness, a lot of people know. A lot of people can tell you, like, I don't want to be bothered, or I don't want you to go away. I mean, we could go into a whole conversation about attachment styles, but people tend to have a basic idea of what they need in those moments. And then if you're in a place where you can provide that, whether it's space or comfort, then yeah, that's a great resource for your partner to have from you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that answered your question or.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that it's always a tricky thing
Hmm.
because it's never our job to manage somebody else's emotions for them,
Hmm.
right? And at the same time, if you can not antagonize them, it does help the situation to be able
Yeah,
to make sure that you're not adding on or contributing. And
that's the
I,
thing.
yeah,
Yeah,
I
I
was,
don't think it's about you trying to make it better, because honestly, it's their own journey. It's something that they're going to have to process through themselves, but you can do things to make sure that you're not making it worse. You're not adding fuel to the fire. And there's nothing wrong with like being there for your person and giving them space that's going to make them feel more comfortable.
yeah. And I think even in times of like space, like not just after you've had the argument or the episode and it's been resolved, but maybe like a month after that. You go, okay, so we have this thing, and I know that you have your emotional triggers, and this is how I identify them, and I have my emotional triggers, and this is how I identify them. How about when we go forward, we kind of have like a safe word, right? Like
Hmm.
you say, this is too much for me right now and I need to walk away, or whatever that looks like, but have those conversations well outside of a time of conflict
Oh,
and
yeah.
and emotions, and try and set up some sort of way that you can be like, I'm triggered right now, this has to be on hold, or whatever that looks like, and work that out amongst the two of you. I mean, obviously there has to be a certain amount of trust and awareness and follow through on these things, that it actually works out the way that you plan it
Hmm.
in the off times. But seems like even trying to be able to come up with some sort of plan, even if it's also for each person to identify, you're really upset and your reaction is triggering me now,
Hmm.
you know, like,
Yeah.
because I think, especially if one partner is not completely aware that they're being emotionally triggered, but you know that their emotional response is triggering you, like,
Hmm.
that's one of those ways that you can take care of yourself. Like, okay, time out, just so you know, I know you're upset and I don't want to take away from that, but I'm now getting triggered. And so
Hmm.
we gotta, right?
Yeah. Well, I think you named it. It's like, one, you have to be able to address these things when you're not in the middle of it. Like, you can't be in that heightened state.
Yeah.
You need to be really regulated when you have those conversations. Two is just the willingness to communicate and having those open, vulnerable conversations.
Yeah. With
And
your
three, both of
partner.
you, yeah, with your partner.
Yeah.
And
And with
then three,
yourself. Because I think
mm-hmm,
I was going to say, just,
yeah.
I mean, even outside, we kind of went into the partnership dynamic, but we have to be willing to be open and vulnerable and truthful with
Hmm.
ourselves too when we're really evaluating, why is this bothering me? Where does this come from? What do I need right
Well, yeah, you're not going to get anywhere if you're not being honest with yourself and not fully
now?
vulnerable, which is hard.
It
It
is
is. I mean,
hard.
I think the most important thing to keep in mind is like you're trying to heal from emotional triggers is that it is a process and you need to be patient with yourself and give yourself plenty of time and not expect overnight results.
Mhm.
And just knowing that we've talked about so many different tools and resources that you can use to heal throughout this process, but don't feel like you have to do it all at once. Just doing one small thing on a consistent basis will make a difference. And I think that's what causes people to kind of quit or pause doing the work is because it can feel like, oh, this is so much work and it's just too much. But any little thing you can do to take care of yourself really does make a difference.
Yeah. And honestly, that's just another aspect of self-judgment. Whenever we're getting impatient with ourselves or frustrated
Hmm.
with ourselves that we're not doing it better or faster,
Oh
right? That's
yeah.
really just back to that self-judgment. Well, Laura Lee, thank you so much for coming on again. You've already mentioned now we might have to do another one on our attachment styles too. And tell everyone how they can stay connected with you, maybe touch base with you if this is something that they might be interested in working with you on.
Yeah, so if you're on Instagram, you can find me at Coach Lollipop. Um, and you're welcome to reach out there. You can also find me on my website. It's theconnectioncoach.com, but the E in connection is actually a three. It's a backwards E, and the three represents mind, body, and soul, but it's theconnectioncoach.com. And you can get in touch with me there too. All my contact info is there.
Okay, awesome. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. And we hope you've enjoyed this new episode in the second season. Tune in next week when we have another episode.